Welcome to AP Biology. This video is on macroevolution. Macroevolution is the formation of new species. There's two types of speciation that could take place. There's anagenesis and there's cladogenesis. Anagenesis is also called phyletic evolution. Anagenesis is going to be where one species transforms into a new species. So that original species is no longer in existence. Cladogenesis is also called branching evolution. That is when a new species buds off of the original species. Cladogenesis is useful because it's going to increase biodiversity, or it's going to increase the number of species that exist in an environment. What is a species? The biological species concept defines a species as a group of individuals that have the ability to mate and produce fertile offspring. So the biological species concept revolves around reproductive isolation. There's two forms of speciation that can take place: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is going to be when a physical barrier prevents two populations from being able to mate. Here we see a couple examples of allopatric speciation. The picture on the top here, we see the Grand Canyon. So the canyon is going to be the physical barrier that separates two populations of squirrels. Now originally, both of these populations belong to the same species. Now that each population is on a different side of the Grand Canyon, they're in a slightly different environment that has different selection pressures. Natural selection takes hold of each population. Each population changes over time to adapt to the environment. Eventually, these two populations become so different that they can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring. Once this takes place, we now have the formation of new species. Here we see the formation of many species of lobster. Here you can see that all these different species formed in the different areas of the Panama Canal. And you can see that you have a physical barrier, a land mass and bodies of water separating the different populations, which led to the creation of new species of lobster. This is an example of what we call adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is the spreading out of new species from one ancestral species. We also saw adaptive radiation take place with Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. One ancestral species of finch diverged into many new species on all the different Galapagos Islands. Allopatric speciation is the major way that new species are formed. New species can also be formed through sympatric speciation. It happens a lot less often than allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is when anything other than a geographic barrier separates two populations. One example of sympatric speciation is chromosomal changes that take place. These changes take place through non-disjunction, when the chromosomes fail to separate during meiosis. This is going to create cells that are polyploid. This does not happen often in animals. However, it does take place in plants. In fact, scientists think that about 80% of plant species have been created through polyploidy. Polyploidy can be an effective way to create new species of plants because plants have the ability to self-fertilize with themselves. New species can evolve through allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is going to occur when a physical barrier prevents two populations from being able to mate. On the top here we see a great example of allopatric speciation. We see two populations of squirrel that live on either side of the Grand Canyon. In this case, the canyon is the physical barrier that separates the two populations. Originally, these two populations belonged to the same species. Now that the Grand Canyon is separating each population, each side is going to have a different environment that has different selection pressures. Natural selection is going to take hold of the population. The population is going to change to adapt to the environment. Both populations are going to accumulate changes over time. Eventually, the two populations will become so different that they can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring. They are then considered members of new species. We often have one ancestral species branch off into many new species. We call this adaptive radiation. On the bottom, we see the adaptive radiation of many new species of lobster from one ancestral species. You can see that these new species formed by having land masses and bodies of water separating the different populations. Now that they're in new environments, natural selection will take place. The populations will change to adapt to the environment. Differences will accumulate, and eventually each population becomes so different that they can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring. We also saw adaptive radiation take place with Darwin's finches. All of the species of finch that live on the Galapagos Islands are all descendants from one ancestral species that came from South America. Each island represented a unique environment. The bodies of water between the islands worked as a geographic barrier. Each population adapted to the environment through natural selection. Differences accumulated, and eventually this led to the creation of new species. Sympatric speciation is when any factor other than a geographic barrier separates two populations. It happens much less often than allopatric speciation. One example of sympatric speciation is when chromosomal changes take place. This doesn't happen often in animals. It happens primarily in plants. Sometimes in plants, during meiosis, non-disjunction takes place. Non-disjunction is going to lead to gametes that are polyploid, that have abnormal numbers of chromosomes. Sometimes a diploid plant will go to being a tetraploid plant. These plants can no longer mate with other plants of the same species. However, plants have the ability to self-fertilize. So sometimes these polyploid plants create an entirely new species that's also polyploid. Scientists believe that about 80% of all plant species have been created through these chromosomal changes. Some common plants that have been created through polyploidy are plants like oats, cotton, potatoes, tobacco, and wheat. New species can also form through non-random mating. This occurs through sexual selection when a subgroup of the population decides to only mate with one type of individual. Again, there's no geographic barrier separating the two groups, but you have some other force, in this case a specific trait that's deemed desirable. Differences are going to accumulate between the two groups, and this can eventually lead to the formation of new species. Finally, the last form of sympatric speciation is habitat differentiation. This is when two groups within the population decide to begin exploiting different resources within the environment. For instance, they might obtain different food sources. This is also going to cause changes to accumulate between the two groups, which can eventually lead to them diverging into two new species. The picture on the left here compares allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Again, allopatric speciation is when a physical barrier is going to separate two populations, where sympatric speciation is when any factor other than a geographic barrier separates the two populations. Once new species are formed, reproductive barriers are going to prevent different species from being able to mate. The two major types of reproductive barriers are prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. Prezygotic barriers prevent mating, or they prevent the formation of a zygote. Postzygotic barriers take place if two different species do mate with one another. There are 5 different prezygotic barriers. The first one is habitat isolation. This is when two species live in different habitats or different environments. For instance, lion and tigers are very closely related. However, lions live in Africa, tigers live in Asia, and this is going to prevent them from mating. Here you see 2 different species of garter snake. They both actually live in the same region. However, species A is an aquatic garter snake. It lives in water, and species B is a terrestrial or land-based garter snake. Since they live in a different habitat, this is going to prevent them from mating. Temporal isolation is when the mating season of 2 different species differs. Here you see 2 different species of spotted skunk. Again, both live in the same geographic region. One species mates in the spring and the other species mates in the fall. Since they have different mating seasons, this is going to prevent the 2 different species from being able to mate. Next, behavioral isolation. Many species, especially birds, have very unique mating rituals. If that ritual is not performed by the male, the female will not be able to mate. By having unique mating behaviors, it's going to prevent different species from being able to mate. Mechanical isolation is when the physical reproductive parts do not line up. Here you see 2 different species of snail, and if you look at the direction of the spirals on their shell, the spirals go in different directions, and as a result, their genital openings are going to be in different locations, preventing the 2 different species from being able to mate. Finally, we have gametic isolation. Gametic isolation is when the sperm of one species is physically unable to fertilize the egg of the other species. Postzygotic barriers take place if 2 different species do happen to mate and produce a hybrid offspring. A hybrid offspring is a combination of 2 species. The major postzygotic barrier is reduced hybrid fertility. Most hybrids are sterile. Here you see the mating of a donkey and a horse and the production of a mule. Mules are sterile, so 2 mules can never mate and produce mule offspring. Another good example of a sterile hybrid is going to be the growler bear. The growler bear is created through the mating of a grizzly bear and a polar bear. These growler bears are sterile, so they themselves cannot reproduce. Another postzygotic barrier is reduced hybrid viability. Often hybrid animals fail to complete development, or they have severe birth defects that are going to prevent them from mating. The last postzygotic barrier is hybrid breakdown. Sometimes the first generation of hybrids is actually fertile, but then the second generation will either be sterile or they'll go through a reduced viability. They'll fail to fully develop. In either case, these prezygotic and these postzygotic barriers are going to prevent different species from mating with one another, and they're going to maintain biodiversity. Hybrid zones are regions where members of different species meet and mate. Hybrid zones are analyzed to study reproductive barriers, In order for two different species to mate and produce hybrid offspring, they have to be fairly closely related. Three things can happen to a hybrid zone. One is reinforcement. Reinforcement is going to be when that hybrid zone is going to decrease in size and the reproductive barriers that separate the two species are going to strengthen. Fusion is when reproductive barriers decline and that hybrid zone is going to increase in size. Eventually those two species can fuse into one. Finally, the last thing that can happen to a hybrid zone is stability. That hybrid zone can be maintained at a constant size. Evolution has the ability to pull populations and to pull species in different directions. Here you see four different patterns of evolution: divergent evolution, convergent evolution, parallel evolution, and coevolution. Divergent evolution is where one parent or ancestral species is going to diverge into two new species. Since these two new species evolved from a common ancestor, they are going to share homologous structures in common. The second pattern of evolution is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is when two unrelated species evolve to share similar traits. They don't fuse into one species, they just share traits in common. This happens because they're both separately adapted to the same environment. Those two species are going to share analogous structures in common. Parallel evolution is very similar to convergent evolution. However, it's when two unrelated species share similar trends in evolution. A good example of parallel evolution is the evolution that took place in placental mammals that live in North America and marsupials that live in Australia. They don't share a common ancestor. However, over time, they have shared similar trends in evolution. Therefore, you're going to see many similar organisms. For instance, you could look at the Tasmanian wolf versus the European wolf. They have gone through similar trends in evolution. However, they are not descendants from a common ancestor. Finally, coevolution is when one species evolves due to the evolution of another species. We see this happen often in nature. We see the coevolution of predator and prey populations. We see the coevolution of host-parasite relationships. The evolution of one species is going to cause the evolution of another species. How fast can speciation take place? Darwin talked about gradual evolution. In gradual evolution, you have small changes taking place over vast periods of time that will eventually lead to the formation of new species. Gradual evolution does take place, but is not the only type of evolution that occurs. Punctuated equilibrium can also take place. If you have gradual evolution happen, you're going to see many different intermediate species in the fossil record. This doesn't always happen. Sometimes you go from having one species in one strata to having one completely different species in another strata. What would cause that to happen? A drastic change in the environment. That change in the environment is going to cause rapid evolution to take place, where one species very quickly evolves into a new species. This is going to account for the lack of transitional species within the fossil record. A great example of punctuated equilibrium is the evolution of the wolf into the dog. Scientists believe that this evolution could have taken place within 100 years. So it could have taken place within the evolutionary blink of an eye, and we would not see any transitional species within the fossil record.